Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. So this is a wonderful story. The year is 1948. Marcus has been living in a rather run-down place in the east side of Manhattan in New York, and now he's going to work for a man called Zach O'Rourke at Clayton Manor, in a property that's an hour and a half outside of New York in a rural area. And so this is all very exciting. So before we continue with the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue, shall we? Marcus did not know exactly how to react to the abrupt end in the telephone call. He should be pleased. Zach O'Rourke had given him the job that started on Thursday, which was the day after tomorrow. Zach O'Rourke sounded as if he had a plum in his mouth, so he was clearly extremely upper crust and came from oodles of money. But he had been so aloof, so ambiguously vague, so very insouciant about everything, so much so that Marcus knew so little about the job he was supposed to undertake as groundsman. Still, a job was a job, and he knew how to take care of the grounds of a very sizable property. It was a job he could easily do, providing, of course, he applied himself and worked very hard. But it was hardly rocket science, was it? With all that in mind, Marcus prepared to leave the apartment block in the Upper East Side of Manhattan at St. James and say his farewells to Talister the cat. And for him this was an emotional goodbye, as Talister had been his only real friend while he'd been living in New York. "I'm going to miss you, Talister," he said, stroking the cat affectionately. "I wish you were coming along with me, but sadly you belong to somebody else." Later that day he informed the landlord, Leonard de la Mare, that he would be leaving for good. But Leonard de la Mare didn't seem to really care, and said just simply, "Thank you very much for notifying me on this matter, Mr. Devaney. I would very much appreciate it if you would leave the apartment as you found it for the next person who rents out the place." And Marcus did just that, scrubbing the place within an inch of his life, so that the apartment block at St. James, well, the apartment that he had occupied, was left in reasonably good condition for the next tenant. Marcus packed up the old antiquated suitcase where he'd found the lucky coins that had changed his life with that spontaneous telephone call to Zach O'Rourke. It had swung the pendulum of his future far away from this dingy, oppressive apartment block that he was sure he was never ever going to miss, apart from Talister the cat, of course. Marcus's rather beleaguered suitcase proudly contained all his worldly possessions, which were so minimal, as Marcus had been unable to buy any more clothes since he'd come to New York. So the fact that his suitcase seemed alarmingly heavy came as quite the surprise for him. Who knew a few clothes could weigh so much? It felt like he was carrying a stone in his suitcase. In the true custom of the day, Marcus hitchhiked all the way to Clayton Manor. As after the war people were kindly disposed to giving people lifts, everyone was in good spirits about the future, believing that America's economy was on the precipice of shortly welcoming a big boom that would change people's prospects for good. And most people felt genuinely optimistic about the future after coming through the grievous horrors of war. And in general, helping out a stranger who needed a lift was very commonplace. "You're going to Clayton Manor, are you, young man?" asked the man who was driving Marcus on the last part of the trip, as he had hitchhiked rides with 3 other drivers along the way. The man who'd stopped to pick him up was driving a dark-coloured, wireless overland jeep. "Where are you going to, young man?" he had asked Marcus. "A place called Clayton Manor," Marcus had told him. "I'm the new groundskeeper for the property there." "Get in, then," said the kind man. "I'll take you directly to the Clayton Manor myself. As it happens, I live a hair's breadth away from the manor, so it's on my driving route." "That is incredibly kind of you, sir," said Marcus, settling down comfortably into the seat, after placing his suitcase in the trunk. "I'm very grateful for the lift." The man offered Marcus a cough lozenge, which he refused politely. "No thanks, but thank you anyway," he said. "They're a nice cherry flavour, you know," said the man. "I always find when I'm driving they soothe a dry throat." "So you know Clayton Manor?" asked Marcus politely. You were saying you don't live far away from the place. Ah, I know Clayton Manor very well, but only in passing as it happens. I regularly do take the very bad road, because it's a shortcut to my house. Unfortunately, the road is infested with potholes, but I hope the authorities will fix it up soon enough. I hasten to say the God-forsaken place, I'm talking about Clayton Manor, of course, has been empty and derelict for years. I'm surprised you've been given a job there, quite frankly, as groundskeeper. I don't even know who owns the place anymore. But I suspect the manor still belongs to a member of the O'Rourke family. The manor's been in their possession for generations, from what I'm given to understand. But why it's never been sold, God only knows. I rather suspect that it has something to do with the demands of an original old-fashioned will going back to the 1800s. That probably was insistent the manor remained in the O'Rourke family for generations, unless, of course, the circumstances were somewhat extenuating. I will say this to you. I don't envy you working there. I've heard a rather unsettling story about the manor, from my next-door neighbour, Cole Armstrong, that, well, let's just say over the years, has certainly given me pause for thought. Marcus was intrigued, and encouraged the man to go on. Well, the place has been neglected for a long time. So actually, if the truth be told, I'm rather glad someone has been hired to clean the place up. And with your being employed as a groundskeeper for the extensive property, that, I must tell you, is nestled on a sizable amount of land, is, let's just say, a promising start. The property has been so wild and untamed. Well, it's become that way over the years. It's a sorry sight for sore eyes, let me tell you, in its current neglected, forsaken condition. I dare say no one would want to buy a place like that. Indeed, some people might think the place deserves a wrecking ball throwing at it. Something less sinister, for example, being erected in its place, perhaps. My wife Daisy thinks Clayton Manor is menacing, to say the very least. She's actually convinced the place is haunted. But I don't believe in such things. But I can see where she's coming from in that, when she says such a thing. By all accounts, with all the burgeoning vines creeping all over the grey walls, it doesn't only look extremely unkempt, but seriously sinister. You're going to have quite a job on your hands, bringing the manor back to some form of respectability, if indeed that is at all possible. As my wife Daisy says, you simply can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Mind you, having said that, my neighbour Cole Armstrong is most insistent that Clayton Manor was one of the most desirable properties in these parts, hosting some of the most grandiose parties for the most affluent in our society, the movers and shakers of our day, so to speak. Some say Winston Churchill attended a party at Clayton Manor, but whether this is true I do not know. The man gave Marcus a warm smile, but his expression immediately fell when he could see the rising look of alarm on Marcus's face, caused by his impromptu words that had been so loosely spoken. The driver, who was a rotund man in his early 60s, with a cheery round face, a distinguished bushy moustache, and a very thin layer of brown hair around the base of his scalp, complemented by a bald space at the very top that was somewhat shiny, had realized he'd caused his passenger a measure of undue disquiet. He was silent for a brief moment, as if reflecting on what to say to redeem himself. He seemed to regret speaking such truths out loud. He nodded soberly, his expression growing more solemn by the second. Don't worry, young man, about what I've just said. My wife Daisy is always telling me that I talk far too much for my own good. She says if I were a woman, I'd be considered a gossip, with a garrulous reputation. But sometimes I just can't help myself. For the record, I didn't mean to cause you undue alarm with my ruminations about Clayton Manor. Take no notice of them. I probably don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. As far as I'm concerned, a job is a job, even though I don't say it lightly that you have a job on your hands cleaning the place up. It's become exceedingly run down over the years. But that is what you can expect if you don't maintain a property. The driver shrugged his shoulders, albeit a little nonchalantly. "Maybe the story I've heard from my next-door neighbour, Cole Armstrong, in regards to Clayton Manor, is highly exaggerated. Sometimes people will do anything to spin a good yarn, won't they? It's human nature to enjoy being spooked. My wife Daisy loves a good old ghost story, as much as the next person," he said with a chuckle, glancing at Marcus through his round spectacles that accentuated the hazel colour of his eyes. "You mark my words, there is probably no truth to the story at all. I wouldn't worry about it if I were you." "What story are you talking about?" asked Marcus abruptly, sitting up on the leather seat, so straight that his back looked as erect as a pencil. As a rather unfortunate electrical prickle of dread seemed to run down his spine. "What story, sir?" he repeated again, his face whitening, the colour draining from his skin, as he privately wondered what it was he was getting himself into. Had he made a grievous mistake taking this job at Clayton Manor from a man he'd never met before called Zack O'Rourke, who by the sounds of things was probably the owner of Clayton Manor? The driver whom he'd hitched a lift from was telling him that the manor was in a bad state of repair, with extensive grounds that by the sounds of things had grown wild and unkempt. So if indeed this was true, it looked like the job that Marcus had undertaken was going to require a lot of grueling hard work. But Marcus wasn't remotely afraid of that. He was used to cleaning up the thickets and thorny briars in his mother's yard in Tennessee, and bringing about an enviable, rather dignified respectability to the place, and he would do much the same for Clayton Manor, he was most sure. "You really want to know?" said the man, who Marcus discovered called himself Edward Kingston. He and his wife Daisy had lived in this rural location near Clayton Manor for over 15 long years. So any insight that Edward Kingston might have on Clayton Manor, Marcus knew might be to his advantage, and would be rather invaluable to hear, even if what the man had to say might be a tad unsettling, or even wildly fictitious. He hoped the latter was indeed the case, and reluctantly braced himself by clenching his stomach muscles tightly together and drawing in a deep breath. He needed to hear what Edward Kingston had to say about the place that was soon to become his home, if he finally became the groundskeeper for Clayton Manor, providing of course that Zack O'Rourke was completely satisfied with his work. And with the pay being so desirable, Marcus had reasoned, even if it killed him, he'd bring some order to the place. He didn't fancy living hand to mouth as he had done for so long, with some nights going hungry when he'd not found work for the day. Harry Truman had been assuring everyone that things were going to get better with the economy. It was true. Marcus was most sure, as many could taste and smell the fragrant essence of prosperity in the air, as if it was a possibility that could be attained. But at this time, as far as Marcus was concerned, it was a slow trickle that hopefully in time would turn into a waterfall of abundance for so many people in America. Nevertheless, with hope in the air, the energy in America had never been more positive, and Marcus intended to harness this upbeat energy to make the most of his life. And this attitude of his resonated with many. Whatever Edward Kingston had to say, he hoped it would not be bad enough to sever his hope for the promising future he hoped to grab with both of his hands, for he had dreamed of going back to Tennessee with handfuls of cash and making his mother so proud as a consequence. Marcus really wanted to give back to his mother, who had given him so much, in sacrificing some of her teenage years to devoting her time in raising him, when she could have easily given him up for adoption. But his mother had been resolutely determined to bring him up as her own, and Marcus was eternally grateful to her for that. Marcus watched Edward Kingston cautiously turn the steering wheel around a sharp bend in the road that was in a very bad state of repair after the war, pitted with pockmarks, potholes and dents. Edward Kingston was wearing a very dashing pair of driving gloves, in a mustard colour. The whole car juddered and shook as it hit all the bumps down a long country road that would finally ultimately lead to Clayton Manor. The road really was in a terrible state, but Edward Kingston assured Marcus that the United States Bureau of Roads had been notified about the problem, as properties in the area, although rural in location, were affluent and owned by people with prestige and money, and often considered to be second homes. It was speculated in the next year or so that the road would indeed be fixed up. For a moment Edward did not speak, and the silence was rather deafening, as Marcus inwardly wrestled with a series of troubled thoughts that he did not want to be entertaining. The words that Edward Kingston had recently spouted, rather like water from a gardener's hose, kept spinning around and around in his head. What have I got myself into? He wondered. For a moment he almost regretted giving his notice in to Leonard de la Mare, who had probably already given his apartment at St. James to somebody else by now. He could hardly go back to the Lower East Side of Manhattan and beg the man to change his mind, just because he'd suddenly had a rather alarming attack of the heebie-jeebies, like an outbreak of hives. Then there was Talister the cat to consider, that Marcus had grown to love, and even though it had only been a few hours on this journey since he'd said his cheery goodbyes to his furry friend, he was already missing the cat. He was now paddling around furiously in a sea of regret. Was coming here to Clayton Manor a big mistake? He was rather beginning to think it just might be. And why was he missing that damned cat? He was annoyed with himself for growing so attached to Talister. His mother had warned him about such things, told him not to bond with animals you couldn't keep, because you'd end up with a broken heart. Marcus felt a nagging tug at his heart as he thought affectionately of Talister. He wondered where she was now. She was probably basking in the sun on the couch in Marcus's apartment that now belonged to somebody else by now. Would the new owner of the apartment bond with Talister, like he had done, he wondered? Finally Edward abruptly broke the internal dialogue that was going on in Marcus's mind, and spoke. Perhaps it's best I don't tell you about what it is believed that happened at the manor, as of course it may not be true. We all know from experience that some stories can get wildly out of hand and completely over the top, and I have a sense that this might be one of them. Marcus noticed he said this with little conviction, as whatever the story was that concerned Clayton Manor, there was no doubt in Marcus's mind that Edward Kingston believed every word of it to be true, but had masterfully sewn an element of doubt into the equation in order to allay any fears that Marcus might currently experience on hearing the story. Edward Kingston shrugged his shoulders and said rather gingerly, The last thing I want to do is to cause you undue upset before you start your new job at the manor. It would not be a courteous thing of me to do. Indeed, if my wife Daisy were to hear me now, and to hear that I'd told you this rather outlandish story, she would be the first to give me a good old clobbering around the ear, let me tell you. And that feisty wife of mine can be quite the tyrant when she wants to be, he said teasingly. I've always liked women with a bit of spirit, and my wife is one of those. I'm a glutton for punishment, it would seem. I would rather know what you've heard about the place, rather than being left in the dark, if you don't mind. Even if the story is nothing but a rumour, I would like to know everything you can tell me, said Marcus rather coyly, who by now was nervously grinding his teeth together with an agitated trepidation. Very well, I will tell you, said Edward Kingston. Now that I've opened a can of worms, I better let you see them all, hadn't I? Let's just say the story happened 20 years ago. Me and my wife Daisy were not living in this rural location in New York State at the time, as this story happened 5 years before me and my wife Daisy moved to this part of the world. We were very glad we laid roots down here. We bought for ourselves a delightful Georgian house in the countryside, not far from Clayton Manor. And during the war we grew our own vegetables, kept a couple of milking cows and some hens. We had it good, better than most, I rather suspect. We certainly went through tough times as a country, but let's just say the war and all its atrocities brought upon by Hitler has made me feel so grateful for the lives we have now, which I'm sure will only get considerably better. Who knew one could celebrate peace like this? I will never ever forget the day when the war was truly over, how everyone was cheering in the streets of New York. We came together that day as a nation, and it was the most euphoric experience I have ever felt. New York was filled with crowds and crowds of the happiest people you have ever seen, waving their handkerchiefs furiously, and American flags were everywhere. Anyway, look at me. I'm rambling on and on again. It's hard to stay on topic. What was it that I was saying? I've clean forgotten. Ah, yes, I remember now. Our next-door neighbour, a very debonair gentleman called Cole Armstrong, who lives in the Georgian property next door to mine. Not terribly far from Clayton Manor. Well, let's just say he told me the entire story. I will tell you this about my neighbour Cole Armstrong, and that is he is a military man that was heavily involved in the war project. He is highly decorated, and I've only known him to be a man of utmost integrity. He has met up with Churchill half a dozen times, I'm told, in an advisory capacity, that is. He told me himself that Churchill was quite the comedian. The man, I believe, has a remarkable sense of humour, although I hasten to say I've never been privy to meeting him myself, although I wish I had. Cole told me quite a few jokes that Churchill had said over dinner one night in London that he attended. He said after a couple of drinks Churchill would make everyone crack up with laughter. And he certainly boosted morale during those bleak times, let me tell you, when people were feeling defeated and washed out by the war. You need a leader like that when you're facing adversity. And Churchill, well, he was one of the finest, was he not? Oh, he was. I believe all this is true, agreed Marcus with a laugh. I mean that Churchill had a good sense of humour, that is. I remember reading in the paper once, I think it was either the New York Star, or maybe it was the People's Voice. I'm not sure which paper exactly. But the article said that when Lady Astor once told Churchill after he'd spent a night drinking a little too much, and was inebriated, that he was hardly able to stand up straight, and was walking with quite the wobble, that he should be ashamed of himself because he was as drunk as a skunk. I gather she was quite the formidable taskmaster, incredibly mediocre, they say, in every sense of the word. The kind of woman that was constantly known for her nagging. The type of woman you never end up marrying, because if you do, you're going to be seriously henpecked. Those are the kind of women you avoid like the plague, and sadly Miss Astor is one of them. He told her in no uncertain terms, I might be drunk, Miss Astor, but at least in the morning I will be sober, but you will still be ugly. Edward Kingston rolled his head back and laughed. That's Churchill for you all over. He's always been very good, extremely witty, at those famous one-liners. No doubt he will go down in history as one of Britain's supreme prime ministers. Anyway, as I was saying, Cole Armstrong, my next-door neighbour, knew Philip O'Rourke extremely well. He said that at the time they were as close as brothers. One day Philip O'Rourke phoned up my neighbour in quite the state. I understand that Philip was quite an opinionated man, who had strong feelings about things, and never suffered fools gladly. Cole Armstrong eloquently described Philip O'Rourke as the kind of man you would want in a wartime situation, to boost the morale of the troops. He was a natural-born leader, although he didn't have a sense of humour like Churchill invariably did. He was much more serious about things, but he had it all together, and more importantly of all, he was not given to panic. So for Cole to say so many complimentary things about this man, I knew that Philip O'Rourke must have been a tough cookie, and someone who demanded a great deal of respect. Cole Armstrong would never be idle with compliments like that. On this occasion, when my neighbour spoke to Philip O'Rourke, who had phoned him from a New York address, where he had a brownstone apartment, as a second property, he was telling Cole that regretfully he had to cancel the card game they had planned for that evening, because he would not be making an appearance, as he was not in the immediate area any more, and would not be returning to Clayton Manor any time soon in the future, if at all. Cole Armstrong, my neighbour, was stunned and taken aback by these baffling revelations from his good friend. Philip sounded like a man who had been through some stuff, and was deeply troubled about something, if you know what I mean. It was a big deal for the O'Rourke family to just up and leave the manor like that, without so much as a by your leave. It was completely out of character for them. So to spontaneously, impulsively leave as they did, without any due consideration and careful thought, was very strange indeed. I do know that Philip O'Rourke's wife Monica was devastated to leave her beloved home, with their 2 sons, Zack and Eli, which were their names. I've got a good memory on things like that, when it comes to supercilious stuff. So getting back to the conversation that my neighbour Cole Armstrong had with Philip O'Rourke on the phone that day, well, he described Philip as being rather flustered, and certainly out of sorts, and he'd never known him to be like that. So he demanded to know what the hell was going on with his good friend. And let's just say Philip O'Rourke crumbled rather like a cookie and told him the entire story. He kept saying to Cole over and over again, "I know you're not going to believe me, but I promise you it's true." Ironically, Cole Armstrong didn't doubt for a second that Philip O'Rourke was telling him the whole truth, because he'd never known the man to lie before. And based on how disquieted and affrighted his good friend had become, he knew this was no fairy tale, even if it did sound exceedingly far-fetched. So something bad did happen at Clayton Manor, for the family to up and leave like that, said Marcus reflectively. How awful! By the sounds of things, they were extremely attached to the manor. It seems such a dreadful pity to abandon a place that you've lived in for so many years, and let a place of such esteem descend into rampant ruin. It's a tragedy any way that you look at it. You say Philip O'Rourke told you the whole story as to why the family abandoned the manor, did you not? Yes, he did tell me the whole story. He told Cole Armstrong everything, and he didn't spare any details. I think he was glad to confide in someone he could trust, who wouldn't think he'd lost his mind like many might believe. It's interesting you should mention that one of Philip O'Rourke's sons was called Zack, said Marcus reflectively, because when I phoned up to answer the advertisement that I saw on a piece of pink stock card, I have to tell you, the man that answered the telephone to my advertisement was called Zack O'Rourke. So I imagine that was Philip O'Rourke's son, who is all grown up by now. Well, there you go then, said Edward, looking satisfied. That confirms to me that Clayton Manor still belongs to the O'Rourke family, which means they never sold the place, which I rather suspected was the case. Philip O'Rourke is Zack's father, and it would seem from what you've been implying that he's more than likely handed the property over to his son, as I doubt that Philip wants anything to do with the place, given what happened to him. I suppose Zack O'Rourke must have fond memories of the manor, having spent most of his childhood there, so the place must be wistfully nostalgic for him. I imagine he probably wants to fix the place up, if he's now advertising for a groundskeeper, and it's about time too, if you ask me. Ostensibly the O'Rourkes have owned the property for generations, and I believe Clayton O'Rourke, the original owner back in the 1800s, must have been desirous for the beloved manor to remain in the O'Rourke family, going through the generations, which makes sense to me. That's why the place, I imagine, has never ever been put up for sale. I told you I suspected this was all down to the legality of an old-fashioned will, and it certainly seems I might be right on that one. But whether I am or not, many in these parts will agree with me that they will be glad to see Clayton Manor finally fixed up after the war. Ironically, there are other houses in these parts that didn't fare at all well when the war was in progress. People simply couldn't afford the upkeep of their large houses. But times are luckily changing fast, and several houses I've seen round and about the place have already got scaffolding up, and are commercing with building projects and much-needed renovations. So it's all a positive start, is it not? There's a great atmosphere for change in America of late. I feel it wherever I go. I feel it too, Marcus agreed. And it's the same in New York, by the way. I've seen a lot of scaffolding around and about the buildings, and I can see they're fixing up office blocks everywhere I go. It's a shame our landlord Leonard de la Mare cannot learn from their example. Good Lord! You know Leonard de la Mare? Asked Edward Kingston, looking rather surprised. Nasty weasel he is. I've seen him around and about. He's stinking rich, but you probably know that already. Never had to work a single day in his life, you know. Well, not really. He inherited all his wealth from his father, who was big in shipping, I believe. That man owns so many properties that he lets out to his tenants, but he can easily afford to fix them all up. But he allows his tenants to live in atrocious, unspeakable conditions. I'm told that he's too damn mean and far too tight to spend money on improving his properties. He should be ashamed of himself. But I don't think he'll get away with letting out apartments in that condition for much longer. The authorities will be on to him, once they've undergone safety inspections. Then he'll be forced to dip into his pockets to fix up some of the abominations he owns." "I'm relieved to hear you say that," said Marcus. "The rat problem on the premises where I lived was getting way too out of control, and I'm afraid Lena Delamere did not do a thing about it." "Doesn't surprise me at all," said Edward Kingston, snorting in disgust. "Some people don't deserve to have money. Never liked that weasel at all. Now let me get back to the story. I seem to be getting sidetracked all over again. Where was I? You were talking about why the O'Rourke family up and left Clayton Manor very suddenly. You mentioned that your neighbour Cole Kingston claimed his friend Philip O'Rourke had been very disquieted about something when speaking to him on the telephone." "Ah, that's right. Well, put simply, Philip O'Rourke lived at Clayton Manor very happily with his entire family. I understand they hosted many grand parties at the manor over the years. Philip's wife Monica was quite the social butterfly, and I was given to understand was also a very beautiful woman who could have her pick of men. But let's just say Philip O'Rourke came from a distinguished upper-crust family at the time. The couple enjoyed the benefits of employing a few servants that lived on the property in the servants' quarters, which was another wing in the house. Monica was domesticated by nature and enjoyed cooking, so was actively involved in working with the domestic staff, of which she had half a dozen. But they did cut down on the staff over the years, as Monica O'Rourke didn't want her house overtaken with too many servants. She liked to feel she had an element of control in running things, although she definitely needed help in a place as big as Clayton Manor. That's most sure. One day, very suddenly, the O'Rourke family began experiencing what I can only describe as paradoxical events that they simply could not explain. One of the servant girls, who was in charge of overseeing all the laundry, claimed she'd seen a monster staring at her through the laundry room window in the house. She then claimed that the monster had been watching her from the woods as she hung out the laundry. She was so affrighted by this thing she claimed to have seen. So afraid was she that she promptly handed in her resignation. Fear drove her away from working for the O'Rourkes. In truth, the O'Rourkes rather thought the girl was somewhat unhinged, out of her mind, so to speak, a little mentally unbalanced, perhaps. In truth, I rather suspect that they were secretly glad she had been relieved of her duties. But two more of the servants' girls also suddenly, enigmatically gave in their resignations for no reasons at all, after working with the family laundry. Whether they saw something is anybody's guess, but it would be reasonable to expect that this indeed was the case. But they spoke nothing of their experiences, possibly for fear of ridicule, and just claimed they wanted to leave their jobs. One day Monica O'Rourke decided to take charge of the laundry. She had lost 3 servants already, who had suddenly handed in their notice, so someone had to oversee the laundry for her. Monica O'Rourke began attending to the washing, in the laundry room herself, sorting out the whites from the colours. She claimed she'd seen a strange face staring at her through the laundry window, with big yellow eyes. This humanoid creature was covered in hair, and seemed to be substantial in size. She said his head was so incredibly large, it took up the entire window, and the creature seemed to be crouching as it peered in at her, which suggested he must be exceedingly large. She said the creature, although intimidating, looked at her curiously, but the experience had significantly affrighted her, because she had no idea what it was she'd seen. Perhaps all 3 servant girls, who resigned one after another, may more than likely have been privy to witnessing the yellow eyes and the strange, unorthodox, human-like face staring at them through the laundry room window. Mrs. O'Rourke told her husband Philip what she had seen. He didn't believe a word of it, of course, claiming that the original servant girl, who'd left their employ, had put wild fancies into his wife's head that didn't resemble the truth, and had probably successfully afflicted the other 2 female servants in their employ with similar fictitious trepidations that had no bearing on reality whatsoever. He went on to say, rather pompously, that women, being emotional by nature, had the propensity to indulge their imaginations rather too much when it suited them, but men honoured only facts and were not easily seduced by wild fantasies created by an overactive, very impressionable imagination. Monica was naturally affronted that her husband Philip was so dismissive towards her encounter. It bothered her greatly that he failed to believe her. So when she saw the face at the laundry room window for a second time, she didn't panic. She believed the creature looking in at her through the window was non-aggressive and had actually smiled at her, so she was not as afraid as the other servants in her employ had naturally been. She decided not to tell Philip about it, over concerns of him going off on a tangent about her imagination, burgeoning out of control like a wild vine. Soon after Monica O'Rourke's bizarre sightings of a face at the window, which appeared to her on several occasions, when she took charge over the laundry, she claimed every time she was hanging out the washing on the line that she had a profound sense that she was being watched, and was sure she'd seen an ambiguously vague figure in the woodgrove, a dark silhouette, humongous in size, that she could not actually identify, as it was far too shadowy, so she wasn't sure if what she'd seen had actually just been a trick of the light. But she was certain that whatever had possessed the brazen gumption to spy on her in the laundry room was now indeed watching her surreptitiously behind a large oak tree in the grove. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.